Hello, and welcome to the next in our series of webinars from the School of Hotel Administration at Cornell on restarting the cruise industry. You are in for a treat this afternoon. We have two prominent CEOs of the top premier brands in the world who are joining us for a conversation on everything they've been doing to strategize and reopen this industry, as well as a leading public health expert. Love to introduce our panel, and just let me set it up for a frame so you can see the magnitude of this issue. The cruise industry and destinations that rely on cruise visitors has been so deeply impacted by this pandemic. And you may not be aware, but the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention a year ago issued a no-sail order, and U.S. ports have not resumed. However, you are going to be inspired by what this industry has done by engaging top medical and public health experts to spend the whole entire last year reimagining the cruise experience based upon newly designed safety and health protocols. So we have a wonderful conversation lined up for you today. Let me introduce our panelists. First, I'm so excited to introduce Frank Del Rio, President, CEO of the S&P 500 company Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings, which operates Norwegian Cruise Line, Oceania, and Regent Seven Seas. Mr. Del Rio assumed this role in January 2015. He's a 25-year cruise industry veteran who has successfully provided an unparalleled guest experience for the cruise industry. He is a world-renowned expert, and joining him is Richard Fain, his equally world-renowned counterpart, Chairman and CEO of Royal Caribbean Group. The group owns and operates Royal Caribbean International, Celebrity Cruises, and Silver Sea Cruises. Additionally, Royal Caribbean is part of a joint venture that operates TUI Cruises and Hapag-Lloyd Cruises. The company's 58 ships carry more than 6 million guests a year to ports all around the world. Joining us also, Helen Gale, President and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, one of the nation's oldest and largest community foundations. Under her leadership, the Trust has adopted a brand new strategic focus closing on the racial and ethnic wealth gap in the Chicago region. Dr. Gale, for almost a decade, was President and CEO of CARE, a leading international humanitarian organization, and she is an expert on global development, humanitarianism, and health issues, and has spent 20 years working with the Centers for Disease Control, primarily on HIV and AIDS. She's also worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so a really wonderful policy expert. And then we also have our very own Professor of Services Marketing, Rob Kortnick, whose research focuses on consumer behavior and services context with a special attention to the service experience management. Dr. Kortnick, prior to pursuing a career in academia, was a travel industry consultant, and he's a recognized expert on the leisure cruise industry. So thank you all for joining us. Frank, I'm going to start with you this afternoon. Could you just talk for a few minutes on how you've been guiding your company since March of last year? What have been your top priorities as CEO of Norwegian Cruise Lines?
Well, as you can imagine, Dean Walsh, and by the way, thank you for having both Richard and I. It's not often that we appear on the same show, but I think in this case, we're both happy to be here. Look, this was a shock to us. 2020 was going to be a record year for the cruise industry, certainly for my company, and we were coming off a record year in 2019. We were hitting on all cylinders, everything was wonderful, and then the pandemic hit. And just to put things in perspective, there were only 456 confirmed cases in the entire country back on March 13th of 2020 when the CDC shut us down. So it was a shock. It was something that we had never done before. We were a well-oiled machine. Everybody knew their jobs. And now we were thrown in disarray, and we had to adapt. That was the word. That was our fighting call, if you will. We recognized we were in a war-like state, and we had to adapt. So in order of priorities, the first consideration was our financials. You know, the cruise industry operates with very little cash on their balance sheet because our cash receipts and our cash out disbursements are so well timed. We know well in advance what is coming in tomorrow, and therefore we don't hoard cash. We use our cash to make investments, to pay down debt, etc. So all of a sudden, we knew that we were not going to get cash coming in the door, and we had to address our liquidity. And as you know, over the last 14 months or so, the cruise industry has had to raise tens of billions of dollars to, no pun intended, stay afloat. So first and foremost, address the financials. A very close number two was, what do we do with our people? And our people included the crew on board the ships, the guests that were on board the vessels at the time of the shutdown. Imagine in our case, we have 28 vessels, nearly 60,000 people on board those vessels, scattered all around the world. And we had to get them off overnight, immediately. And in some cases, we could do it overnight, immediately. In some cases, it took over a month to. Then we had to address our crew. And that took months, because of all the travel restrictions and visa issues and the fear and the drama that was occurring back then. Then we had to take care of our shoreside folks. Their jobs depended on us operating and their families and so forth, and our travel agent partners, and just down the line. The cruise industry is a community. And that's one of the sad things about what's happening, is that so many people have been affected directly and indirectly. We had to worry about our ships. You know, our ships are our assets, and we had to protect them. And if anybody who's ever owned a boat knows that one way to break a boat is not to use it. And so we had to spend lots of money to make sure that the vessels were well maintained, crewed properly, etc. And then last but not least, and I'll stop there to give Richard an opportunity to also answer, is our future bookings. You know, people book their cruises months and months and months in advance. And so even though we were shut down in the immediate, at the time, we didn't know how long it was going to last. Quite frankly, we thought this might last 30 days, maybe 60 worst case. And so we needed to keep the marketing and the sales machine going for future departures. Now it's been 14 months, and we're still keeping the sales and marketing machine going, because there's always a cruise tomorrow, the next week, the next month, and we have to fill them. And as you know, the basic model of the cruise industry is every ship goes out full. The question is, at what price? And so I'll pause there and
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what a once in a lifetime strategic crisis in terms of staying, to your point, afloat. Richard, I know you just spoke about this issue a few days ago at a conference. I assume you had very similar challenges. And could you speak to that, as well as the work you've done with Frank in partnership?
Sure. So I think the challenges that we faced are very similar to ours, were very similar to what Norwegian faced. I think, to put it in perspective, the economic cost to us in the surrounding area was about $1 billion a week for us, for all of the, not just our two cruise lines, but all the cruise lines. But we're 25% of the industry, so it's that kind of an economic cost. And as Frank said, we didn't expect it to last this long, but we did have to establish our priorities, and we established them early. I think Frank's gone through the kinds of issues, but I would say we were very much looking to, how do we get out of this? How do we solve this problem? How do we look forward to the future? And while none of us expected it to last this long, we knew that we had to do it in a good way when the science was terrible. Because remember, when we started, the CDC were suggesting that you not wear masks. The CDC was suggesting that the right thing to do was to clean surfaces. And today, both, and in fact, within a relatively short period of time, they realized both were wrong. So we wanted to bring in some advice. And we put together Norwegian and the Royal Caribbean Group put together the Healthy Sail Panel. And thank you, Dean Walsh and Dr. Gale, for helping us with that. This was a panel of leading experts in the field, and not the field because it's a series of fields. So we had not political leaders, but leaders of, for example, the co-chairs were Dr. Scott Gottlieb, ex-FDA commissioner, Governor Mike Leavitt, the head of Health and Human Services, and yourselves. We had ex-CDC people, we had engineers to do a complete view of this. And the panel spent over 3 months studying all aspects of this and coming out with a series of 74 recommendations. And our objective was to make sure we can't eliminate risk, but we wanted to make sure that the risk on a cruise ship was lower than the risk of walking down Main Street, USA. And with those 74 recommendations, because we control the environment, we actually felt that we could make it in a way that was safer than in the home community. So that was a key priority. The other one I would just mention is communication. Communication with our people who are key and who are suffering from this. Communication with the communities that we serve. Communication, we're all lucky. We all survived the disease. Those who got it and those who didn't were safe. We all have jobs, etc. But so many people lost their jobs, had no income, were worried about their mortgage. I mean, it's been a terrible time. We seem to be coming out of it. So our priorities were deal with the financial crisis, make sure that we were safe, and also prepare for a way to come out of this in a healthy way, both medically and financially.
Yeah, no easy, right? Easy to do. How impressive that the two of you reached out to one another and partnered for the health of the industry overall. You don't see that every day, and it's wonderful. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Rob, I do want to get to you and talk and understand a little bit more about the ports and other forms of commerce that have been impacted. But Helene, can you speak to the work of the Healthy Sail Panel a little bit, and why the CDC, in your view, really put this no sail order in place? What are the challenges the industry faces, and what was the work of the panel to really help address those challenges? Oh, and you're just on mute.
Thanks so much, and it's wonderful to be with everybody. And I would just start by saying, when I was first called by Governor Leavitt to consider being on this panel, it initially struck me as a fool's errand. Who's going to be able to make cruise ships that had such a bad name in the beginning of this pandemic safe enough for people to, take a trip again? And I kind of decided that, if we could figure out a way to make cruise ships safe again, it would give us a lot of important public health information for other less challenging environments. And so, I took it on as kind of a challenge. This was, and again, if we think about where we were at the time, this was right after the episodes with the Diamond Princess and, all of the bad press that cruises were getting at the time. And, for those of us in public health, many of us cut our teeth on investigating outbreaks on cruise ships, et cetera. So, I think there was this whole backdrop of people thinking that the cruise ship industry was one of the least safe, and what our task was to do was to make it one of the safest. And, I think that, again, kind of to the credit of the two companies that came together, the spirit in which people undertook this was incredible. There was a real spirit of collaboration, a real spirit of working across not only the two corporations, but also across different disciplines. You had people who were really focused on the physical infrastructure. There are people focused on the testing, the laboratory work, the kind of treatment, the medical and health, individual care aspects, and all of that coming together to really think about, how do we make this as you said, Richard, kind of safer than other environments and look at what was possible. And one of the things that I think early on I recognized, and I think others in the panel, is that you're right. This is a controlled environment. This is an environment where people can actually say, if we want to make it safe, we have the will to do it, we have the resources to do it, and we have the technology to do it. And I think that's what, kind of all came together in a way that ended up leading to these 74 recommendations. And, again, these recommendations were done pre-vaccine. So we developed a series of recommendations that even in the absence of vaccines, we all felt would have really reduced the risk. Again, there is no such thing as risk proof, but that we would substantially decrease the risk that anybody, crew or guest, would enter with SARS-CoV-2, that we reduce the likelihood that there would be transmission aboard if somebody happened to get on with it, and what were all the things, and reduce substantially the risk that anyone would develop the infection as a result of getting off for destinations. And so, we looked at all the different points in which the virus could be introduced, that it could spread, and that there was any way of breaking the seal, if you will, and breaking the bubble. And so that's what our recommendations really were predicated on. How do we buy down the risk as much as possible? And then we got handed the gift of the vaccine, which I think has allowed us then to even look at how can we make it even safer. So, again, I won't go into all 74 of the recommendations, but I think we felt really good that at the end of it, we had created the conditions or had put forth recommendations that would allow the creation of a condition of an incredibly safe environment, and as you both mentioned, probably safer than places externally where things could not be as well controlled.
Thank you. And I can speak for Frank and Richard that you both adopted them and just brought them right into your teams to implement.
And I would just say the other thing, again, and I think the two representatives of the cruise ship industry, but others as well, I think have done a good job of also looking at the public perception issue, because I think that was a very real issue. And I think, continuing to put out the message of how safe cruises can be, and all the work that went into making this an even safer experience than they were before, I think it is also an incredibly important aspect of this.
Well, and if I could just add, Kate, because yes, we followed all 74 recommendations of the panel and have been careful to implement them. But I think it's also significant and speaks to the credibility of the panel and the work that it did, that the whole rest of the cruise industry, all the other players in the industry, also agreed to adopt the panel's recommendation and also agreed to abide by its terms, which included auditing performance under that by an outside independent auditor. So not only did we do it, but the credibility of the panel and the process was so strong that everybody else in the industry agreed to abide by it.
Wow, which is really remarkable for one industry to come together this way. Rob, let me just turn to you if I could, because you're an industry expert who studies this topic. What other issues come to mind that you're looking at on restarting the industry, whether it's ports or other forms of commerce or even leisure that's impacted by the shutdown of the industry and all of the work that the cruise lines are doing to safely restart?
Sure. When I think, Richard gave a number of with $1 billion or something that was just how much of an economic hit the cruise industry has taken. And, I think what we miss is that there's a long tail in terms of the value chain that the cruise industry provides. And it's not just the cruise lines themselves and their employees. It's not just the port cities and New Jersey or South Florida or Galveston, Texas, or, the West Coast. But it's the whole supply chain. So, for example, the forecast for 2020 was that there would be about 16 million cruisers in North America, right? And that was obviously when we had to shut down in March, that was significantly reduced. Now, not all those people are in drive markets, right, to the main ports. So you're looking at, at travel agents who were affected, who were selling cruise tickets and derive, a lot of commission income from the cruise lines. Airlift, right, getting people to the port cities. Many people, when they fly in, they come in a couple days early to a port city, and so there's hotel, there's food and beverage. They do pre-post cruise tours and activities. So it's not just the cruise industries that the cruise lines that found that they were suddenly, in an economic paralysis. It's all these other industries that are affected, that the cruise industry really helps to generate that sort of demand. Even rideshare. I mean, the impact was pretty significant. And I think a telling example, and Richard and Frank can speak to this more, is the port cities that are ports of call. So the island destinations in the Caribbean, Bermuda, Barbados, right? Some of these which, historically may have been a little ambivalent about their relationship with the cruise industry, saying, well, we would prefer stayover tourism because we get people who stay longer and they rent hotel rooms. And these island destinations have made some very, interesting overtures to the cruise lines recently, saying, well, if you can't sail out of the U.S., home port here, home port in Bermuda or home port in Barbados. And even, we'll help, if it's possible, we'll see if we can help get crew vaccinated. We'll see if we can, help with getting crew airlifted in and to increase air travel. So to me, that's a huge signal about how much the industry is missed, is when these islands are saying, no, we almost had a natural experiment, right? We used to think about, well, what if we didn't have cruise? Well, for the last 14 months, they didn't. And see what the economic impact is, and have said to Frank and to Richard, what can we do to bring you back, right? And I think that's a pretty powerful statement.
And I would just say, as the person who thinks about health and entered into this from the public health side, I gained such an appreciation of the industry itself and the importance of it, not just for our economy, but all the other economies that rely on the cruise ship industry, and how, this absence and shutdown is having such a global impact, and particularly, as Rob mentioned, on some of these small island nations who, their economy is totally pegged on tourism, and cruise ships being a large part of it. So, I definitely came away from this. I feel like I've gotten a maybe not a PhD, but some sort of a degree in the cruise ship industry, and a real appreciation for it.
Mm-hmm. Respect for the impact. Well, let me talk a little bit about going forward and perhaps around restarting in these ports. Frank, both cruise lines have said all crew will be vaccinated. And Frank, you've also stated that Norwegian will require, you have smaller ships and an older passenger base, all your passengers to be vaccinated. Why did you come to that decision, and how will you implement it?
Well, society is going towards vaccination. We're all racing to get everyone vaccinated. And I think Dr. Gill will agree that these 74 protocols are good, solid protocols, but there's no substitute for vaccinated people. It is the best line of defense. And so we said, look, for both, in my opinion, competitive reasons, and in order to stimulate the CDC's reluctance to get us back into service, we put forth a proposal to the CDC back on April 5th that said, look, you're issuing all these guidelines. They're difficult for us to implement. Many of them are impractical. Many of them don't make sense. You're trying, I know what you're trying to prevent. The ultimate prevention is to have people vaccinated. So we said we'll commit to everyone on board being fully vaccinated, crew and passengers, which meant children under the age of 16 or 18, depending on which vaccine you're talking about, couldn't come on vessels. And we said, look, that's a blow, because at the Norwegian brand, roughly 20% of annual customers are families, people with children. But I was willing to forego that 20%. And I don't think it would be full 20. Some families will come without their kids. But even if it was 20%, I'm willing to forego that 20% in order to protect the 80% that are on there on the vessel without question. And of course, for Ocean and Regent, which target a more mature customer, children really aren't a factor. So what we wanted to provide the safest place on earth. As Dr. Gale mentioned, the cruise industry got a badly deserved rap, if you will, early on because of what happened on certain cruise ships. It was very early. No one knew what was going on. There was a lot of drama. There was a lot of anxiety. But now we know better. And so I would look you in the eye, Dean Walsh, and tell you that if everybody on board is vaccinated and we're following the protocols of the Healthy Sail Panel, by definition, a cruise ship becomes the safest place on earth. You can't point to a factory, an office building, a grocery store, anything where you're guaranteed that everyone around you is fully vaccinated. And so we think it's an ironclad proposal to the CDC. We've been having discussions with the CDC. I feel we're moving in the right direction. And hopefully we'll get some good news soon.
Yeah. Super interesting. And Richard, also, your team has been doing some incredibly impressive work opening and operating safely in Singapore and Israel, especially in partnership with the governments of those countries. Can you talk a little bit about the protocols you've created to ensuring cruising is the bubble safe experience, including some of the technological innovations you're using and what you're learning from the test cruises? And you have to come off mute. There you go.
There you go. You'd think by now I would remember that. So I think what we've seen is a tremendous opportunity. We've been operating now both in Asia and in Europe, and we've carried over that period of time during this pandemic 125,000 guests over the period. And we've done it with our protocols. I'll talk about those in a moment. And we've had, of course, no matter what we do, there will always be cases on board. I think that was one of the things that we've all acknowledged from the beginning, and one of the things the Healthy Sail Panel has acknowledged. What we need to do is make sure that when there is a case, it's an isolated case and it doesn't become an outbreak. And the science has allowed us to do that. So with 125,000 guests, we've had exactly 21 cases. And all of those cases have been quickly identified and quickly isolated. And so it hasn't upset the other cruisers on board the ship. It hasn't upset the local communities. There's no burden. And that's really what we're talking about. And coming back to what Dr. Gale said, she used the term bubble. So the thing that makes the cruise ship different is, yes, there are a lot of people together, so that is an issue that you have to deal with. But the other side of it is that we control who everyone is. Now, all of that, and by the way, the 125,000 guests that we've handled have been essentially all pre-vaccine, because the Europeans didn't have the vaccine, the Asians didn't have the vaccine. America's done very well with the vaccines, but these other countries haven't. So even without the vaccines, we're able to create this bubble. And it's really through the tripartite thing. The vaccines would have helped. We didn't have those, but we will now. But testing is amazingly effective. Coming back to when this started, when we voluntarily ceased operations on March 13th of last year, in the United States, the only place you could do a test legally, it was illegal for anybody to do a test anywhere outside of the CDC headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. And their capability was limited to a few dozen a day. Other countries were doing thousands of testing. So you had no testing capability. But now we can test everybody. So we can create that barrier at the beginning to vastly reduce the chance that one gets on the ship. The other thing we can do is we can do contact tracing. So if you come down with COVID in the United States, the public health official will call you up and say, by the way, do you remember who you've been in close contact with? And of course, no human does. On the ship, again, unlike anything else, you all wear a wristband. It will keep track of any person you've been in close contact with. That is within 6 feet for a cumulative total of 15 minutes. So now we don't have to guess as to who you've potentially infected. We can go to them and we can test them right away. So the result is we can contain it. And those are, if you can do that, you just don't have an issue. So we're doing all that. It's working abroad. By the end of June, we've announced 11 new itineraries in Greece, in Italy, in the UK, in Barbados, in Bahamas, in Bermuda. I mean, with those 11 itineraries, and we have more coming, and with other people doing something similar, by the end of June, we'll be taking guests on at a rate of 500,000 a month. So at that kind of rate, you really see we can demonstrate the safety here. And I think it's already unarguable. The industry has carried close to 600,000 guests. We've carried 125,000. The industry has carried close to 600,000 guests safely and without any disturbance to the local community or the other guests. So it works.
It works. And Frank, you're doing the same thing. Your ships are getting ready to stand up and start in specific ports as well.
You're on mute, Frank. Frank, you're on mute.
I never sounded better, right, Richard?
Well, I was going to say, from a marketing point of view, if you want to keep that up, I mean, that's okay with me. We may not compete on safety, but I'm quite happy to mute you in the market.
Oh, thank you. You're very kind. But Kate, we, similar to Richard and other cruise companies as well, we've announced 2 new itineraries. Well, we never cruised before, Jamaica and the Dominican Republic. And this is one of the risks to the U.S. economy, that if we find, by happenstance or necessity in this case, that we can operate profitably, or perhaps even more profitably, out of the DR, out of Jamaica, than we did out of U.S. ports, Miami or Port Canaveral, whatever it may be, we're going to keep our ships there. So there is real economic risk that if this continues longer, the great things about ships is they have 3 things that buildings don't have. They have motors, propellers, and rudders, and we can move our assets anywhere, and you're seeing that happen. We've also announced the opening of 6 vessels in Europe, the Mediterranean and Northern Europe, beginning in late August, early September. But the good news that we haven't talked about yet is the demand. The demand for cruising for future periods has never been stronger. At our last earnings call, which is now dated, it's been 12 weeks or so, we said that we are substantially better booked for 2022 departures than we were at the same time for 2019 departures, which is a record year, and for 2020 departures at this time in 2019, which would have been a record year. So the resiliency of the guest, of the cruise guest, is really showing its strength. Of all the things that I worry about, and I think Richard would join me on this, fundamental consumer demand is not one of them. We just worry about whether we can actually operate the cruises that we're selling, because at the end of the day, even though the CDC still has shut us down and we are hopeful that we can resume cruising over the summer, there are other parts of the world that are closed down. I mean, you're saying that Asia, Australia, New Zealand is outright closed down. most of the European countries are. We're hopeful that by the time this July, August, September timeframe comes along, that they will be open and therefore we can operate. But right now, the pandemic is not under control in a lot of parts of the world. India now is making, front page news about their outbreaks. And India is important to us, not as much as a destination, but as a source of our crew. After the Philippines, India is the leading provider of crew on board our vessels. And today, it is very risky business to bring crew on board from India because of the outbreaks they're having. So it is a complicated issue, but and perhaps Rob can mention or can pick it up from here in terms of marketing. But the good news is that the resiliency of the consumer, the resiliency of the travel agency community has never been stronger. And if we could operate 2022 sailings the way they're scheduled today, 2022, I think, would be a record year for the industry.
Incredible. Pent-up demand.
Pent-up demand.
Yeah. Rob, comments on that, as well as what you think will be even better around the cruise experience going forward from a service level?
Yeah, well, all the indicators I've seen is that this pent-up demand is a real thing. And we're hearing this from the travel agent community in particular. And as Frank and Richard have talked about, is bookings. And it's not just bookings that are future cruise credits. These are new bookings as well that are also very strong. The cruise industry historically has been very resilient, whether that was after 9/11 or the financial crisis. It bounces back very, very quickly. Really, the only constraint on cruise demand over the past 30 years has been the ability to build ships fast enough, right? It's shipbuilding capacity is the main constraint. It hasn't been demand. Demand estimates for year over year, the compound annual growth rate is, just under 7% for the last 30 years, which is phenomenal, right? From a little over 3 million, maybe 30 years ago, to 30 some million forecasted. That's just astonishing growth. As far as the guest experience, I think one of the interesting things that's come out of this, and, we've probably heard this cliche a lot, that that Churchill's statement, never let a good crisis go to waste, that some of the things that the industry has been thinking about to improve the guest experience were kind of forced into play due to the pandemic. One I look at that is really interesting is even just the use of the private islands, which I think Richard made a statement in an article I read several months ago saying that who would have known 7 or 8 months ago that the private islands would be this oasis that could possibly help to bring the industry back, because these private destinations are fully controlled, right? So the cruise lines control the entire experience. They control everybody who gets on the island. It's usually only people who are part of the cruise line themselves, so they're fully tested or fully vaccinated. So talk about an environmental bubble, right? And so now you've got cruise lines that have learned from running an island and the food and beverage, the service, right, the water parks, whatever it might be. So having these be available first creates a level of comfort and a reduced risk perception. Same thing with technology. I know that the idea of an app-based safety drill or muster drill had been percolating for a while before it became something that was important due to COVID. The good old days when Richard and Frank were coming up as leaders in the industry, when the safety drill, the muster drill on a ship with 600, 800 passengers, you would have to go to your cabin, you get the life jacket. It was a great photo opportunity, and it's completely different now, because with ships with 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people, that muster drill, which muster literally means to gather, it's you and 150 of your closest friends all of a sudden standing together to find the muster station. And the fact that Royal Caribbean, and then I believe shared the technology with NCL as well, to say, let's do this app-based, right? We're going to do Muster 2.0, which means you no longer have to gather in one place. You can use the app to learn, where do I have to be? How do I put my life jacket on? And so now the guest doesn't have to go through that experience, which was a pain point for a lot of people. Right? You got on board the ship, you're 2 pina coladas in your bathing suit, and you've got to go and gather for the muster drill. And now that pain point has been removed, and it's also something that helps with the safety of the guests. So things like that, contactless mobile boarding, to speed up the process, and also to reduce the need to interact with desk agents or to pass a credit card back and forth. I mean, these are technologies that the industry's developed that were sort of developed for a different reason. It was to reduce those pain points and make a better experience. But now they become something that has a lot more of an imperative under the circumstances. So I think long term, this kind of technology, even the 74 recommendations from the Healthy Sail Panel, these are new protocols. This is a new way of thinking about delivering a sanitary experience that's only going to be better for the guest in the long term.
Yeah, for every kind of illness that the guests might carry around with them. It's been a really impressive as an outsider to watch how these two cruise companies have rethought everything. And Helene, I want to build on a comment that Frank mentioned around the notion that this is a global industry, that the cruise industries are in every port around the world and working with government and health agencies, and the crew is international. What do you see going forward as the really global health issues that we're going to have to pay attention to that will impact the cruise business, especially with this international crew and customer base?
Yeah, so, one of the things that I think, we talked a lot about was really how what the cruise ships do can influence public health more broadly. And so I think one thing is, and, Rob, even some of the things that you mentioned that could be used outside of the cruise ship industry, I think there's a lot of learnings that could help public health more broadly. And as we put together the recommendations, and I don't know if I've ever been on anything where we dissected things with as much detail as we did around the panel to really come up with these recommendations. I think that they can have huge impact on how we think about disease prevention and control in general. I also think it's critically important, as this is not going to be the last pandemic we face. And so I think, again, this hopefully will shortcut and build kind of resiliency in a way that can make a difference far into the future. And I think it also pushes some of the issues. We talked about vaccines, for instance, and we know that, vaccine availability is very different around the world. Well, if you've got a global workforce, even though the cruise ship industry is only but so large, nonetheless, I think the demands to have everybody, the imperative to have everybody vaccinated does mean there needs to be a push on vaccine availability, on more consistency in terms of actually even the authorization of vaccines in a global sense. So I think there's a lot that, the fact that the cruise industry does rely on this global workforce and the global nature of the cruise routes themselves means that there's a lot of bi-directional work in health and safety that will be good not only for the cruise ship and the cruise industry, but broader. And, again, I think we all know that we've got to be prepared for what the next COVID-19 type pandemic is going to be. And I think we will be much more prepared next time than we were this time.
You're talking about a very interesting partnership of industry with policymakers. And the cruise line is leading the way in this. Frank, I'm going to ask you a question just to follow up on this. What might not the typical consumer be aware of as it relates to the cruise industry, the work of the panel, working with the CDC, or just plans going forward?
It all depends whether we're talking about the general population, which probably is not well versed, or our past guests who we communicate with all the time, the travel agents and so forth. Look, I think that if you are a cruiser, past or thinking of being a cruiser in the future, you're keeping up with what's going on. That's our job as an industry, as a marketer to do so. And I think people recognize the lengths that we have gone through to make ships safe. I will tell you that there's every day more and more people are wondering why the cruise industry is being treated so differently than the rest of the industry, where casinos are open, resorts are open, hotels, you can fly in an airplane, a train. The CDC has said that if you're vaccinated, you can travel safely anywhere in the world. The CDC has said that as of last Tuesday, there were 84 million Americans fully vaccinated. Only 6,000 have been confirmed to get COVID after vaccination, which is 0.00007. Google it, and you'll see that's the same odds as you being hit by lightning over an 80-year lifetime. So once you're vaccinated, getting COVID is very, very rare. And if you get it, it's no longer a big deal because that's what the vaccine is supposed to do. So that's one of the reasons why we, Norwegian, decided, you know what, for everybody's sake, everyone has to be vaccinated. And we talked about the cruise experience moments ago. Look, initially, we're going to do everything possible to make sure there's not a single outbreak. Now, we can't guarantee it, as Richard mentioned, but that's my goal. And as we build confidence, as we build momentum, with everybody on board being vaccinated, we'll start peeling back some of the protocols that we don't think are necessary long-term. Because at the end of the day, you're on vacation. You want to have fun. You don't want to be wearing a mask while you're in the pool. You don't want to be wearing a mask while you're getting a massage. You don't want to get a pool while you're playing craps. And so there's a balance between health and fun. And right now we are erring on the side of health. And once we build this confidence and momentum, then we'll start peeling back some of these protocols that are not normal.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting point. And I know, Richard, you're doing the exact same type of planning. We have a question about ports. How do people move freely around ports? Or how do you keep people from gathering indoors and large amounts of masses, I should say? What are you thinking about this and the innovations of the cruise experience that will make it even better going forward?
Well, you're absolutely right. And I would come back that that's not only important to our guests. As Rob said, that's really important to these local communities. More so in some areas than others. In Alaska, they have the whole season only lasts a couple of months. If we don't get there soon, these people will go almost 3 years without revenue. And literally, if we don't go there within the next couple of months, it's 3 years without revenue for a lot of these people. In many of the Caribbean islands, the cruise industry brings in half of their GDP. Imagine a country whose GDP is cut in half throughout this. So it's really very important. But it's also very important to our guests. The destination is one of the first things they look to when they're considering where to go. So again, coming back to what Rob said, we have these private destinations. That's proven. Those were gangbusters before. And it's doing well. It'll be a great boon because we control it. Much like coming back to Dr. Gale's point that the ship is a controlled environment, the island is a controlled environment. Nobody sets foot on our private islands without going through our protocols. Now, when we talk about going to a destination, we don't want to just eliminate the bubble and say, okay, you can go out and go off the ship and get infected. So what we've been organizing, and it's been very successful, is we call it curated tours. So we will go to an operator and say, if you want our guests to come to your shop or go to your farm or whatever it is, or this archaeological site or this architectural phenomenon, We need to know that they're safe. We need to know that you have taken the kind of precautions that are necessary to make sure that they are safe. And so in the beginning, you will go in our curated shore excursions. So in effect, we're extending the bubble out from the vessel. And yes, it's because we look at it from start to finish, and it's unlike anything else. If you go to a theater, they can't check your vaccination, they can't put in protocols, they can't control the environment. We can do testing before, during, and after the cruise. We really can check it all out, and that's the advantage of having the controlled environment.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So as an outsider who's new to this, Helene, over the past year, you've talked about it a little bit, but as you've learned about the cruise industry, about the work of these two CEOs leading their companies, what have you observed as a public health expert about this industry and this vacation experience going forward?
A few things. First of all, I think how, as I mentioned before, just how important it is as an economic engine, and what that means to people not only in this country but around the world. I also got a real appreciation for how well they can standardize protocols, and how intensive the training is, and what the accountabilities are. Again, I think part of being able to be in is somewhat in controlled environment really does mean that you have greater access to your staff, if you will. You can do the kind of trainings that sometimes need to be repeated to make sure that people are developing habits. The accountability is clear because you're working, in close proximity to the people who are your supervisors. But I was just really impressed with the level of organization, the ability to standardize, and I think the culture of the ship, and how everybody really is so motivated to do the right thing. It's there is a different spirit that came through as we were talking, just about how where oftentimes we would wonder, well, are they going to adapt this or not? Well, there is this, we're all in this together kind of spirit that I think is unique in terms of employment and employers. And so, I guess a lot of the ability to do this is unique because of the unique fabric and the culture of the cruise industry. And I think, another thing that came across, I think, in our discussions is also the passengers. People who come onto cruise ships are going to be much more motivated in many ways to stick to protocols, to think about safety, because, they know what it would mean for them to be in an environment where a major public health threat was occurring. So I think there is a different notion. The other part that I was really impressed with was the level of medical expertise already on board. We worked with really high-notch medical professionals as we were from the cruise ship industries as we were developing these. People with long public health careers themselves. A high degree of medical specialization and ability to take care of complex medical cases. So those are some of the things that I think people just don't understand about the unique nature of this industry.
Really, I think it's a great point, especially the medical capacity to take care of passengers. Rob, before I turn it over to our two leaders for an education for our students, predictions on the future of the cruise industry from where you sit?
Well, I'm obviously very optimistic about the cruise industry, and I think it's, what has to happen is happening right now with what Frank and Richard are doing, which is the industry needs to take stronger control of the narrative, right? The narrative kind of ran itself for a while when all the bad news was coming out, and the industry has actually long been very innovative when it comes to health and sanitation. I'll ask Frank and Richard, how long have you had hand sanitizer stations in front of your restaurants, right? It goes back 20 years, 15 years, right? You've been doing that long?
At least.
At least, right? So, you know, in many ways, the industry is already well ahead of the curve in terms of sanitation and operational procedures. And so I think it's just a matter of the CDC and the public saying, all right, we're going to give you a chance. As both Richard and Frank said, that, you know, cruisers love to cruise. I mean, your cruise fans are crazy. They love to cruise, and they get it, and they know that it's a sanitary environment, and they know how to protect themselves and their fellow cruisers. And so it's just a matter of, let's get back to business and put these protocols in place. So for that, very optimistic, right? That you know, some of these things that have already been imagined and have been thoughtfully put in place with the Healthy Sail Panel. We just need to implement.
Innovation, right? This is leading the way. You know, we're at Cornell. We've got a student population here. I just can't close without tapping into our tremendous CEOs here. You shaped the development of this industry more than anybody else, the two of you. Leadership advice, things you've learned as you reflect on this experience the past year. What would you tell our future leaders? Frank, and you would like to start?
You know, Kate, so many thoughts come to mind. What I tell you, the first thing is no crying in your beer. You know, don't feel sorry for yourself. You got to quickly develop a plan with input from your team. You know, there is no I in team. It's an old cliche, but if you ever needed a strong team, this was the time, because everything was new. We had no playbook. We had never practiced this. We were running on the fly. And having confidence in your team and your team in you for leadership, everyone looks to someone for leadership. And in many cases that fell on my shoulders. And so you lead by example, you show resilience, you show conviction, you show them a plan. Everybody wants to know a plan. And so we quickly developed a plan. And then you have to execute on that plan. And you have to monitor it to make sure that it is going according to plan. I think Richard mentioned communication early on in his discussions. We're all running in the dark. We don't know what's going to happen next. We're all nervous. We're human beings. Communicate. And so I over-communicated. For the first 8 months, I would write a weekly letter that went out to the entire Norwegian team, shoreside and crew. And then for the last 4 months, we've gone to twice a week, and that's been very well received. So over-communicate when in doubt. And then above all else, be human, have empathy. We're all going through this very difficult situation where, you know, people have died from this. The economies of individuals, of cities and states and countries and of companies have been devastated. Empathy goes a long way. Thank you for having me this afternoon.
Oh yeah, thank you for sharing your expertise and leadership inspiration. And Richard, closing comment on leadership advice for all of us.
It's the important subject. It's really our only job. And I think it really does come down, first of all, to have, it's always about the people. When we look at our company's success throughout the years, so from its very start, long before I was involved, and as we've grown, it's always been the people that have the passion to do such a good job. Now, what's been interesting about this is, in this particular crisis, unlike almost any other crisis I've been involved in, people can't do their normal job. Most of our people are involved in providing cruises. And all of a sudden, you found somebody whose normal job was food and beverage needing to talk to a foreign government about health standards because we needed their approval. And we've had to work with some 30 governments around the world. So you really need to help people into new areas. But our experience has been that people have stepped up to it. They really want the experience. They've they've embraced it and say, this is a terrific thing. I'm learning something new. It's also difficult because we're all isolated. And as good as we may think Zoom is, and some people do think it's very good, it's isolating. And you don't have the normal give and take. You can't get the kind of help you get. So communication, again, I think we both said it, but you can't do enough communicating. People want to know. And so I have to say I've been extraordinarily fortunate to have an amazing group of really caring people doing amazing work over this period. And Kate, thank you for having me. Really appreciate you. Thank you guys for what you do for the Healthy Sale Panel. That is just terrific. It sets an example, not only for us, but I think it's something for other industries to see that when you bring in the right expertise in all areas, and people will work together to something that will be better not only for our industry, but for the world as a whole.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And that's exactly as Dr. Gale suggested why she came on board, to share her expertise, no pun intended. So thank you, Dr. Gale. Thank you, Frank, Richard. Thank you, Rob. I cannot wait to have, and Rob, I know this for class, cannot wait to have the three of you come to Cornell in person and get you in front of our students in person. We look forward to that day. Thank you for joining us for a really interesting and impactful conversation. And thank you everyone out there for joining us this afternoon. Take care, be well, and we will see you again very soon.
Thank you.